Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our debate this afternoon, coming to you live from Town Hall Europe, here in the heart of Brussels, and the home of Friends of Europe, which once again has the pleasure of hosting today's debate. I'm Jamie Shea. I'm a senior fellow at Friends of Europe, and it's my honour to be the moderator for tonight's discussion, which is dedicated to the future of multilateralism. Now, where I have my ancestral home, which is in Ireland, there's a famous sort of joke, you've probably heard it already, that when you're sort of lost in the beautiful Irish countryside, you roll down the window of your car, you see a chap coming out of a bar, and you say to him, "Sir, how do I get to Ballymurphy?" And he says, "Well, I would not start from here." And I suppose if we're looking tonight, ladies and gentlemen, at the future of multilateralism, this is not the best day or the best time in our history, perhaps, to have this debate, as we're under the shadow of the largest military conflict that we've seen in Europe since World War II, ongoing as I speak, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is not only testing the European security arrangements that we've been built up since the end of the Cold War, but indeed the whole architecture of the United Nations, the prohibition of aggression, and the entire international order. So certainly we could start off by seeing this as yet another failure of multilateralism to deliver on its high principles and promises. Perhaps also it's a test now for multilateralism not preventing a war, but at least making the aggressor pay a high price in terms of sanctions and isolation for that aggression, and certainly not encouraging other authoritarian leaders to believe that they too can get away with something so egregious as trying to take the existence away from another state. But if we want to perhaps also this evening look at why multilateralism has failed and how it can be repaired and strengthened in the peace and security area, we also know that we need multilateralism to do lots of other things as well. And when we first conceived of this debate, we called it multilateralism in the post-pandemic world, because of course the crisis that has really tested that multilateral system for the last 2.5 years has not been a war, but has been COVID-19. We've wanted multilateralism to define the rules of globalization, to foster trade, and to increase economic prosperity for all, to promote development, to empower women and protect minorities. We've wanted it, as I've said, to respond to global challenges like COVID-19 and to provide a more equitable access to health for all of the peoples of the world. After COP26 in Glasgow and looking to Egypt later this year, COP27, we clearly need multilateralism more than ever to preserve us from a world of 5 degrees of global warming over pre-industrial levels and to stay at least close to 1.5. And we've wanted multilateralism too, so that we don't have a world, which is what we're actually facing today, where might is right and great powers do what they like and the weaker suffer as they must. But we want a world in which the smaller states and everybody has a seat at the table and a voice in shaping their future and the future of humanity in the 21st century. So tonight we want to see, although the answer may seem obvious, what is the health of the multilateral system today? Where is it working and where is it not working? If we have to start fixing it, and obviously we do, where should we begin? And as we are in Brussels today, which of course is the home of both the European integration process and also the transatlantic community and the transatlantic relationship, and perhaps today we recognise more than ever that thank God, we have those two forms of union, the transatlantic union, the European Union, at a time when we face such unprecedented challenges. we also want to ask ourselves, what can the EU do? What can NATO do? What can the transatlantic do to generate the kind of momentum that we require to heal multilateralism? But multilateralism is for everybody, and we can't be successful if we don't partner with others. And that's why, typical of Friends of Europe this evening, we not only have speakers from the EU and from the transatlantic relationship, come to those in a minute, but we also have voices from other parts of the world that also have their role to play, from Africa and India as well. So 4 speakers tonight and a lot of difficult topics to get through. We're going to have 2 speakers at the beginning, followed by some questions and answers. So, ladies and gentlemen, you know the modus operandi by now. Please don't leave it. Come in quickly. We have only an hour and a quarter, so please signal to us by raising your hand or entering something in the chat, using the hashtag that you want to come in so that I can recognize you. So some quick questions after our first 2 speakers. Then we'll have our second 2 speakers. We've got a couple of interventions from our young leaders on the Debating Europe platform, and then the remainder of the time for questions to everybody on the panel. So I first would like to welcome, as our first speaker, Christina Kokkinakis. She is a senior official in the EU External Action Service. We couldn't have wanted a better speaker on multilateralism, by the way, because her job function is that she is the Director for Values and Multilateral Relations and the Deputy Managing Director for Global Affairs in the External Action Service. So I'm delighted to welcome Christina Kokkinakis and thank her sincerely for joining us this evening. I'm going to ask her to start off, and then we're going to go immediately to that other part of the world that I described earlier with Mohammed Seshan, who is the foreign affairs columnist and the author of Flying Blind, India's Quest for Global Leadership, to get a perspective from the rising powers of the world. Then I say quick Q&A, and then afterwards, delighted to pass the floor to Rosebel Kagumiri from Africa. She is the editor of African Feminism and a member of the Advisory Council of the Centre for a Feminist Foreign Policy. So we're going to get a multiplicity of different perspectives, I know, from Rosebel. Rosebel, also thank you for joining us. And finally, as I said, the indispensable transatlantic perspective. Nobody can present that better than Michael Ryan, who has served recently as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European NATO Affairs, a distinguished American diplomat, Foreign Service officer, for many years also political advisor at the US European Command. And Mike, I suppose on a day like today, with security so much at the forefront, this is something where you no doubt will give us your insight. So that's it. Great panel. Time for me to stop talking. Hand over, first of all, to Christina for some introductory remarks. Madame, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good evening from Brussels. What you see is my office here, my new office in the External Action Service behind me. I started this job on the 1st of January. Before that, I was the Austrian ambassador to the PSC, to the Political and Security Committee of the European Union, and I have had over 25 years of career with the Austrian Foreign Service. Well, when I was preparing my speech, and I think this is common to all speakers tonight, and when I woke up this morning, I realized that I could not possibly take whole of the speech I prepared. A couple of points, yes, but basically I would like to turn it around, unfortunately, because when I was thinking of the word that comes into my mind when we all woke up this morning, the word is helplessness. It's helplessness. This was a word that we heard also at the Munich Security Conference a couple of days ago, but it is the word that really comes into my mind. Helplessness in the sense that we were not able to prevent a crisis. We seemingly, as international community, were not able to prevent the so-called point of no return when we look at Ukraine and at the current developments. Also, we didn't seem to have the ability to bring the full weight of what we are, of what we can bring in as international community. And there is this narrative of a series of failure we are confronted with. There is, of course, two more points, the amount of human tragedy we see when we look at Ukraine, and of course, the amount of human rights violations, and unfortunately also the envisaged possible violations of international humanitarian law, because we are in a state of war. Let me look ahead of the future events when it comes to the United Nations. I'm both responsible for United Nations, but also for human rights. So what comes into my mind is, of course, the Human Rights Council that is there to open on Monday, on the 28th of February in Geneva. It will last for 5 weeks, and it is undoubtedly so that it will be overshadowed by, of course, the dramatic and recent events in Ukraine. And here I want to be very, very clear. When we talk about violation of human rights, this means to us violating law. Why? Because human rights are law. They are international law. They apply to everyone, and they apply everywhere. Without, and here I want to be very clear, without any distinction between countries, while dealing at the same time impartially and forcefully with all civil and political, but also with all economic, social, and cultural rights. And this is extremely important for me to underline today. There is also for the European Union no justification for any degrading or any exploitation of other human beings. Here we are very clear. On whatever basis, be it nationality, race, ethnicity, religion, gender, etc. These all might seem as words you might have heard lots and very often, but I think the value of these words become even more important during these dramatic days. I was referring, of course, to Ukraine. There are many other country situations we will pay some attention in the coming weeks during the Human Rights Council. Some of them regard Belarus, they regard Myanmar, Afghanistan, Northern Ethiopia, you name them. Of course, we will also look at the European Union at the major thematic challenges, and you already mentioned a couple of them. First is, of course, the interdependence between human rights, climate change, and development. This is very dear to us, but also the impact of digital transformation and its consequences for human rights of all, improving women's rights around the world, protecting freedom of expression, freedom of speech, etc., dealing also with religion fanatism and the freedom of religion or belief, you name them. And of course, it goes without saying, and this is something you referred to when talking about multilateralism, that the EU cannot do multilateralism alone. You need two to tango, and we are also not there to impose any human rights on anybody. And here also, let me be clear, nobody is perfect. The European Union is not perfect, no other country is perfect, no other organization or regional group is perfect. That is why we can only promote multilateralism and human rights together with others, together with local governments, together with regional organizations. Let me name, for instance, the African Union, let me name the Organization of Islamic Conference, let me name the Arab League, for instance. And we can only do this by continuing to support human rights defenders. And I want to be very clear on that. This is an extremely important point of our daily work and of our cooperation. We think that there is a huge space for cooperation in the United Nations. It is not easy. We see the United Nations Security Council being increasingly blocked. I guess we will see this also in the next days again. But in the end, multilateralism is about looking for topics where our interests intersect and where we can cooperate with other regions, with other countries. It's about the common goals we share. It's about freedom. It's about justice, and it's about the peace in the world. For that, you know that we have an extremely strong partnership with the United Nations as European Union. We believe in that. We think it needs to be further strengthened. And here I would like to say that even though we might have the feeling multilateralism doesn't work, I still think it works. And I think if it does not work, we all need to make it work. I think this is really the appeal I would like to make tonight. I think that the challenges we are facing is in the solutions that we can find multilaterally, and these solutions have to be the result of a common and collective action. It is only together that we can respond to global crises, threats, and challenges that no country alone can address by themselves. We think that there is space for cooperation and space for also speaking out against attacks against universality of human rights, against an erosion of the rule of law, and erosion of the multilateral system. So human rights is not about being left or right, it's about being right or wrong. And with that, I will hand over back to you.
Christina, thank you very much for getting us going, and your sentence that if multilateralism isn't working well, we have to make it work, I think is probably the leitmotif for the debate this evening. We've already got somebody who wants to ask a question, but before I come to that person, let me thank you for kicking us off. And now we will turn to one of the possible partners for the EU in improving multilateralism, a power that's really risen onto the international scene over recent decades, India. I mentioned Mohammed Sashari is with us this evening. Mohammed, from your perspective, is the multilateral order fair and equitable? Does it serve, as you see, the interests of India? Is it easy for India to fit into that order productively, or do you think that, you know, for India to be satisfied, it needs to be changed in some fundamental way? For example, like membership of the Security Council. But anyway, you're the speaker, not me. So, Mohammed, again, thanks for joining us. And we're all very interested in your non-European perspective on all of this.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you very much for having me here on this very august panel. Very difficult questions there. And, you know, to be honest with you, I do want to answer that bit of the question that you've just asked, but also want to give a bit more of an overview on where emerging powers like India stand and where multilateralism stands today. As you mentioned in your opening introductory remarks, my book is called Flying Blind: India's Quest for Global Leadership. And so perhaps from the title of the book, you can already see where I'm going with, what I think of India's foreign policy at the moment. India is in a state of flux. Its interests are in a state of flux. Its interests are not quite as coherent as they once used to be. But I will come to that in a little bit. But before that, I think that it's either quite apt or it is unfortunate and not apt that we are speaking about this on this particular day, given that Russia has just invaded Ukraine and thrown Europe and the rest of the world into turmoil. Earlier today, when that event happened, the UN Security Council was actually in session. And so on social media, where I'm very active, I found a number of people blaming the UN Security Council for being as toothless and useless as one person put it, as it turned out to be, that it was not able to stop this from happening. But I do want to say that this is not the UN system's fault. It's the fault of the member states. The UN, after all, and the UN Security Council, after all, is only as good as its member states. And so if they're not able to come to a consensus on something, they can't really act. And that's the nature of multilateralism. That brings me to the main point that I wanted to bring here to everybody's notice. The headline for today's event runs, "Revising the Vows, Post-Pandemic Multilateralism." I want to put to you that there is today a debate over the vows themselves, or as Christina put it earlier, international law and international norms. I agree with her that they pretty much do apply to every member state and every nation state in the world. But the problem, sadly, today is that not everybody seems to agree on what these laws and norms and vows should look like. And so what we are seeing today, and I think it's also signified in the UN Security Council's inability to act on Russia or Myanmar or Syria or these other conflict zones, geopolitically sensitive, important conflict zones especially. is signified by this battle of values that's going on in international politics, which could determine and undermine even the future of multilateralism and the effectiveness of institutions. We have to remember that we are in a very important phase of history. This is happening for the first time since the end of the Cold War, or as Francis Fukuyama put it at that point in time, the end of history, because at that point in time, of course, the West was all powerful and preeminent, and pretty much everybody else was able to, or rather everybody else was following what the West had laid down, because the West had the influence, or the United States in particular had the influence to make things happen. That is no longer the case. We are now in a multipolar era with several important actors that are now pulling this tug of war in different directions. Russia and China, for instance, are reinstating an order of anarchy, or as Jamie put it in his opening remarks, an order of might is right. You do see, for instance, Russia challenging the sovereignty of states in Eastern Europe, Ukraine most recently, and China doing the same thing in the South China Sea. What is very interesting or unfortunate here is that these countries are actually going back on their commitments under international law. Quite frankly, in the South China Sea, for instance, China has already signed the UNCLOS, or the UN Convention on the Laws of the Sea, but it refuses to accept the tribunal ruling on its dispute with the Philippines, even to this day, under that very treaty that China itself is a signatory to. So they are, in some sense, now revising the vows in a negative manner. They are rewriting or redefining what international law looks like. The West, on the other hand, is in withdrawal in the eyes of most parts of the world, although President Biden has reversed some of President Donald Trump's actions, such as going back into the Paris Climate Accord and other such things. It's very clear to the rest of the world that the West is not the force that it used to be, or the United States is not the force that it once used to be. And the Afghan withdrawal did not help that cause either. Europe is also under throes of populist movements in different countries, although not quite as serious as the Trump movement turned out to be in America. My own country, India, is a bit of a dark horse today. India used to be a voice for multilateralism in the early days of its independent republic. Under Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, India became an active member in mediating conflicts around the world, in Korea, in the Indochina, in the Congo, and so on. But India then, over a period of time, started to take a back seat. And what we are seeing today in India is actually a revision of its own national identity. India used to be a very proud secular liberal democracy, but there are factions and sections within Indian politics today who are questioning whether India should continue to be a secular republic or if it should give in to Hindu majoritarian political trends. As such, what we see today is a lack of consensus, and that is resulting in this anarchic order of might is right that we're now seeing, rather than the one that existed at the end of the Cold War or at the end of history, as Foucault put it at that point in time. And we are seeing a lack of consensus. This is to finish off my opening remarks, I do want to conclude here, is manifesting itself everywhere in Myanmar, in Russia, on the climate change issue, and so on. And so building global consensus has become more important and more pressing today. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that crystal clear, very coherent presentation. You're right in the sense that it's no good renewing the vows if renewing the vows means revising the vows. That's not what the exercise was due to be about. And I totally take your point that if the major powers are not committed to multilateralism and it becomes only the affair or the interest of the smaller powers, we're not likely to see progress, but we're likely to see backsliding. No, thank you. Good points. I mentioned that after our first two speakers, we would have some quick Q&A. I'm delighted that Isabel Durant, who is a good friend of Friends of Europe. Isabel, good to see you back today, and I know that you always ask good questions. So over to you first, and then afterwards, Pascaline Gabarit, please, also a good friend who is there too. And both ladies, when you ask your questions, if you could just indicate perhaps the person to whom the question is put, that might make it easier in terms of the answers. So Isabel, the virtual microphone goes to you first.
Thank you so much. And I will not repeat all was said. It's true that the context of the multilateral system is not the best one today, especially today. But I would like to insist on one aspect, which is for me really key. And with the SG Guterres and all the UN system, we are totally sure in the new common agenda that the Guterres would like to develop, that the first problem is trust. And there is a kind of a permanent mistrust in all institutions. The EU, the UN, and institutions are not perceived as credible enough, credible or able to deliver and to show that it works. So I think that in addition to the problem that we know today and the difficulties of the Security Council regarding the veto right in the Security Council, we are not expecting that it could be solved rapidly in the Security Council. Nevertheless, I think that we don't have to forget all the concrete issues that the multilateral system could really provide to people. And it's true that with the pandemic and the question of vaccine, we were not really the best in the vaccine distribution, and the waiver for the capacity for the developing countries to have access to the vaccine and the productive capacity for them to provide or to themselves to really produce vaccine. But the COP26 was not very good. Result of the COP26 was really low level, and not able to really to provide what is absolutely needed today. It's money for adaptation, not only mitigation, but also adaptation. Yep. And that was really a problem in the COP26. So I think that we have to show concretely, and I think I am in Geneva with the Conference on Trade and Development, but also when you look at the Geneva bubble, we have a lot of organizations doing a lot concretely, the WIPO, of course, WHO, not only Human Rights Councils, because we know how difficult it is, even despite the fantastic peer review that we have a system. Nevertheless, it's not an easy place to really solve or improve.
Isabel, I'm butting in, and you'll forgive me for that. You're totally right, of course, to point out that there are always parts of the system that work better than others. And the UN, the advantage, of course, is it has all of the agencies that can do brilliant work, even if there's paralysis in the Security Council. But Isabel, given the time constraints, I need to ask you, you've made an important statement, but do you also want to turn that into a specific question for somebody before I take the virtual microphone away from you, if you don't mind? Back to you.
I think that we have really to show concrete result on the ground. That's what we have to deliver very soon in order to rebuild. And we have also to work with the media, disinformation. And we have seen that with the Yellow Jacket, with a lot of groups everywhere in the world who mistrust normal traditional media and traditional power. And that's where we have to work. I think that intergovernmental machinery is not the only one to do multilateralism. Okay. We have to work with NGO, we have to work with a lot of other partners in order to increase or improve the capacity of the multilateral system to show locally his importance.
Okay, Isabel, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Many important points. And I agree with you. Something may be good in theory, but our populations will trust it only if they see it working in practice. That's the proof of the pudding, and dominating the information space. You didn't ask a question, although maybe any of our four speakers may wish to comment. Give them the opportunity. But first, Pascaline, please, over to you for hopefully a question. But if it's a statement, then please make it briefly, Pascaline.
Yes, sure. Pascaline Gabory, Pilot for Dev. I agree with, of course, with everything that has been said. Today, as you say, it is a sad day for peace and security in Europe, also for multilateralism, of course. And it's also revealed the contradictions of the European countries, because we've seen that we are really dependent on Russian gas and also natural resources that are really detrimental for the climate. So I hope that this really strong crisis that we are facing is going to help a stronger multilateralism based on freedoms, human rights, as Christina has said, and democracy, support to democracies, and also to shape a better sustainable future. Thank you.
Okay, Pascaline, so that was a statement as well, but a useful one. Thank you for that. I'm hoping that the third and final speaker in this round, my colleague and also senior fellow at Friends of Europe, Paul Taylor, will ask a question. Paul, don't let me down there. A question. Microphone is yours.
Thank you, Jamie. I will ask a question. Never want to disappoint you. Given the current impasse in multilateralism, which has been very well described, do the panelists think that we should continue to try and build a consensus with the Russians and the Chinese, having failed to do that? Or do they think that what we have to do is to try and work with coalitions of the like-minded, coalitions of the willing, to advance our goals, and perhaps not spend so much time on international institutions that are unable to provide that consensus? Thank you.
So thanks, Paul. Thanks for the question. So formal multilateralism versus the more mini-lateralism, informal kind. Okay, that was a question. We also had two statements. Now, I'm going to go in reverse order and ask if there's any comment quickly. First, Mike Ryan. Any comment on any of that? Microphone is yours, Mike.
Thank you, Jamie. I'm more inclined to Paul's second perspective, but I'll talk more about that during my intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Rosebell, speedy, quick comment on any of that, without taking away the thunder of your intervention in just a few seconds, of course.
Yeah, thank you so much. Definitely, it's very important for me. We just finished the Africa EU Week, and it was very important for President Cyril Ramaphosa from South Africa to reiterate the fact that if we cannot cooperate on matters of life and death, then what are we cooperating on? And emphasizing EU's blocking of waivers for African countries to be able to produce vaccines, and this shows you that the crisis that the globe is experiencing in terms of responding to people's needs across states.
Yes, this is the gap between the rhetoric of aid and cooperation and then the practical reality when industrial interest, business interest, intellectual property hits the ground. Yes, we've identified that as a big challenge. We have all of the good principles, but how do we make them work? Finally, to Christina, any points that you want to pick up that came out of those first three comments? Of course, you'll have plenty of opportunity to come in later in the Q&A session, but a quick reaction now, if you wish.
Yeah, Jamie, I think one quick reaction is that basically what all interventions also showed is that we as the West or as the North, we cannot succeed when we will not, without cooperating with others, be it governments, again, be it civil society, be it human rights defenders, be it academia, be it regional organizations. So this is really where we should head to. And I think it's for us to look for topics that are not only attractive to us, to the West, to the North, however you called it, but that are also addressing real concerns from developing countries. And here I'm thinking, for instance, of digitalization. This is, or of mental health, which in the aftermath of the COVID-19 crisis has shown to be also of much more interest for the developing world than it was before the pandemic. But happy to continue to listen.
Yeah, no, thanks, Christina, and thanks for that point. Yes, we need to define the topics that bring everybody to the table. That's very, and thank you for that. Okay, thank you for our three first questioners. And now we go to our two final panelists. I mentioned Rosabelle Kagomiri, who's already spoken. Rosabelle, you've heard a lot already about multilateralism has to work for individuals, for people in the South, as we used to call it, still do sometimes, as well as the North, has to work for women, has to empower people, protect their rights. So from your perspective, in all of the work that you're doing, how do you see the multilateral system working or not working? I send you the virtual microphone.
Thank you so much. Definitely, I come here in the shadow of the war that is happening. It's just been launched, yet another war, and a reminder that this kind of imperial experimentalism has been happening, not just in Europe, just because this is in the heart of Europe. It's been done in the continent, the African continent, in the Arab world, that this is what we have been seeing across the last decades. So in many ways, we've seen so many many security regimes that have not worked for people, especially formerly colonized people, as I would call them. We have seen this happening from Syria to Mali, having all these security regimes that do not work for the people and not sustainable, and maintaining troops in countries where they are not serving any long-term purpose, but only entrenching imperial interests. And we can no longer continue to really ignore the fact that what drives the failure of multilateralism is really not recognizing the interest that drives the current regime of multilateralism, which is not necessarily justice and representation of the people's interest, but the might and the powerful. And we can't run away from that. And for me as a feminist, and understanding the hegemonic power that runs the world as it is, and the inability to really visualize a future that is stable unless that power is dismantled, unless the chase for the empire to keep whichever empire you represent or you come from, to keep amassing wealth, amassing territory, is still a threat to human security, as we see it happening right now. And it's still happening, whether it is war is the worst form of imperialism, is the worst manifestation of imperialism. But underneath war, there lies so many violations that are not every day brought to light, just because war is dramatic and it compels us to see the ugliness of human nature or human undertakings. It's very important to understand that before war, there's always regimes that show us that this is not going to last. In the current security order, it does not work for the majority of the world. So does because there's no security order without the economic subjugation of different people. So is the current economic regimes that we see that continue to make most of African countries, Francophone countries in Africa, still paying so much of their money to maintain former colonial power. That is a fact. And those are things that have to be talked about. They have to be confronted. The current efforts for the ECOWAS economic bloc to try to get its own currency and the blockages it is finding is very important that we look at that there is no multilateralism that does not that it's not going to work if it's not going to have the long-term aspirations of the people to be free, to be dominant. So for me, it's very important. And looking at away from the West African bloc, looking at what's happening in the Eastern African region, in the Horn of Africa, where all these powers have military bases, amassing military bases on the African continent, the buildup of that power is going to result into something. It's already resulted into something. It might not be as dramatic, but from Djibouti to Somaliland to Somalia to Mogadishu, we see the cost of amassing all this power, which is not in the interest of the people of Somalia or the Horn of Africa. And we see the proxy wars that are happening in the region currently. That's not multilateralism that is serving anybody right now, but it's coming at a very great cost because we continue to hide behind interest and say it's working, kind of having a tape measure, a band-aid, and we say that the system is working, but the system has not worked for formerly colonized people. That's from my stand. And we have seen it with the vaccine nationalism. It doesn't come out of nowhere. Of course, this kind of ethno-nationalism, racism, and the rest have been around. But we have seen it, right from Trump's America to the UK to Europe. It's very important that we rethink on where the world is and really engage in being equal.
Thanks, Rosebel. Rosebel, thank you. You said a lot very quickly there, a lot of important things. But you're right. I mean, obviously, it's got to work for everybody. Including people in what you call the post-colonial world. I understand that very, very well. It's got to be geared to the interests of people. Obviously, it's got to show a certain degree of equity. particularly when it comes to major crises like COVID-19. And it's got to, if it can't transform power structures, at least constrain those power structures that you mentioned. Yeah, you gave us a very interesting, different perspective on things there, and a big test. Of course, for the globality, the global validity of multilateralism. Okay, we've got a final speaker. Delighted to welcome a good friend back to Friends of Europe. He really is one of the long-standing friends. Mike Ryan from the United States, as I mentioned, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. Mike, multilateralism for many people will be embedded in collective security, the prevention of war. You know, we think of the Covenant of the League of Nations, all of the conventions in The Hague at the beginning of the 20th century, and then, of course, the UN Charter. And so I suppose for many people, the ultimate test of multilateralism is the ability to stop wars, to deliver humanity, as it said in the UN Charter, from the scourge of war. So, Mike, what has gone wrong?
Well, Jamie, thank you. And thanks to Friends of Europe for the invitation. Thanks to everyone who's already intervened. I have much to agree with, and I'm fully behind everybody and everything that's been said. After 40 years in the Department of Defense, I've retired, and these are my personal views. I have to make that clear up front. Defense and security is fundamental to all this, as you said, Jamie. So we've talked about civil society. We haven't talked about the private sector, but equally important. And I'm going to make my remarks from the perspective of government. That's all right, in the context of, as you said, multilateralism, making for a more secure world. And how do we go about that? So in the realist sense, I would refer to multilateralism as a classic interest-driven activity wrapped in a democratic cloak, or in the cloak of democratic values. So why do we have multilateralism if all nations act in their own self-interest all the time without exception? It's because nations use multilateral approaches when their own elements of power are insufficient. And within international organizations, they use those to combine their power for shared purposes, but also to limit the options of others. And when we think about international relations in the security and defense context, we can think about three-dimensional chess, which the takers, as you referred to them earlier, the mighty, are on the top level. International organizations were multilateralism in the middle level, and the givers, those nations that give up only what they have to, on the bottom level. And so how does that work? You know, more altruistic nations, I like to think the United States is one, the top level, prefers to work through international organizations because there's great value to the U.S. interest and to democratic values that we hold dear of working at the middle level with international organizations. But that's not true for everyone, quite obviously. The problem comes in with heads of state and government are the ones who define the interests of their nation, and they're more influenced by domestic political concerns than they are by international concerns and the concerns that we've been talking about this morning. And so how do we use international organizations to temper that imperative that democratically elected politicians seem to have? Well, we've designed international organizations with each having their own respective mandate. In other words, define a collective interest, and we work through that organization to pursue that interest. But the nations within those organizations still pursue their national interests, even in the face of undermining the collective interests. For example, Turkey blocking things at NATO, or Cyprus blocking cooperation with NATO within the EU, mostly because Turkey's in NATO, just two examples. And therefore, within these international organizations, we find multilateral groupings of, or communities of interests of like-minded nations who want to pursue their interests. And that's to the good because it makes things happen. It's also to the good that they do that within the context of an international organization. There's many such examples in the European Union, for example, the Euro, the Schengen arrangement, and we now have defense projects within the European Union, but also within NATO that are just amongst self-identified nations. In other words, if they want to play, they have to pay. So nations can't leverage the international organization for their own interests because nations go off and do the things that they need to do, again, within the context of those interests. And that's a good thing. But the biggest problem today, as the previous speaker said, is the absence of a well-defined collective interest. It was apparent at the end of World War II, and in the absence of which the pursuit of national interests supersedes our multilateral purposes. In short, we're more transactional and less values-based in our activities, and we're no longer doing the right thing because it is the right thing, because there are nations who prevent us from doing so. So that's the state of multilateralism. What works well? Well, I mentioned the communities of interest of like-minded nations managed within international organizations. That works very well. What's not working so well, and we see this today, is that achieving consensus on anything below the collective interest, and the collective interest in light of today's circumstances is when life and limb, life and death are threatened, then people tend to rally to the cause. But short of that, they haven't been able to. But the other shortcoming we have in multilateral forum is the speed of decision. Autocrats can make decisions faster, marshal resources more quickly, and stay the course longer than can democratically elected governments simply because they're elected. And getting nations to align their interests together takes time, as we've seen in the run-up to today's events. And we get in this situation, I think, for two reasons: a failure of imagination. We just don't think about the future in the ways we should based on current trends. And a suspension of belief. We really hope for the best outcome as opposed to preparing for the worst eventuality. So we need a multilateralism that's more future-looking, future-oriented, and really future-proofs our nations and our communities. So what should we do? Well, I think there's two important points. The first I mentioned, the necessary primacy of our collective interest. We need to sell that to our populations. We need to convince people that we're all in this together and our collective interest exceeds our national interests. Primarily because if we don't accomplish our collective interest together, then our national interests will be forfeit. And as we do this, and the Summit of Democracies that President Biden organized is very important, we need to strengthen the core of our democratically minded, free market economy-based nations, not just the transatlantic community, but beyond Japan, South Korea, Australia, and others, to strengthen all of us. And we need to work through partnerships in a coherently integrated way to bring those partners into this community of integrated nations, but with respect. When India comes more fully into the world's integrated set of democratic nations, again, it's up to them how they do that, but our whole collective is going to change because it's going to be more Indian in character. And that's altogether good and fitting. And it's something that we as a transatlantic community need to grasp and accept. So we need to reassert our collective interests as preeminent. We did this at the end of World War II. We have to realize we're still implementing the plan to win the peace following World War II. But we've lost sight of the collective interest because we've, until today, not had war in Europe for 70 years, despite what's been going on in the rest of the world. And we need to get back at that and remind people of that. There's three things we need to focus on as we do that, as we support the rules-based world order, is look at our resilience. We're being attacked is the best word, undermined through indirect actions that disrupt our societies, create disinformation campaigns, and make our democratic resilience, our politics more difficult. So we need to focus on shared resilience across our community. We need to demonstrate unity. We need to work more on free trade and more economic integration. We need to uphold, as has been discussed, human rights as the preeminent goal within this activity. But if we're not unified, then our adversaries will split us apart. And we need to collectively demonstrate our autonomy in the global commons. Multilateralism is effective when it does things, as has been said. And we do this in the South China Sea with freedom of navigation. We do it increasingly in cyberspace and in space, but we need to do it more so in the information space. Again, to pursue a collective interest that exceeds our national interests. So I'll just leave it at that. There's a simple reality. We're all in this together. And so we have to work together. Thank you.
Mike, thanks very much. I mean, I thank you for your very sober, but also quite sharp analysis of how multilateralism works and what makes it work and what doesn't make it work, and the notion that it works on the basis of a community of interest and well-defined collective interest. The idea that future multilateralism has to be based around a core of democratic nations defending human rights and democratic values, and this agenda that, the key three things that are the big tests of building resilience: integrating the world economically in a free trade, open market system, and keeping those global commons, the space of cyberspace, the oceans, on which everything depends, on which we all need, like we all need oxygen to breathe, keeping those global commons open for everybody to use peacefully. So thank you. So that's quite a lot of substance on the agenda for the discussion. So again, ladies and gentlemen, we've got about 25 minutes, which is not bad by the standards of Friends of Europe, believe me. So plenty of opportunity for everybody to come in, So please, take advantage of the opportunity. The panelists are not going to hang on after 6:15 and wait for you all evening to come forward with your question. So it's now or never, please. And before we go to the audience, I mentioned earlier that we've got some of our young leaders on the Debating Europe platform who have wanted to intervene. And if I've understood correctly, we're going to see Rita from the Netherlands, who should pop up immediately and put to you, panelists, her particular question. So Rita, hopefully you are there.
My question is, are we doing enough, or how can we improve the situation that we are working on towards climate change? Because we've seen that we've seen the outcomes and the discussion of COP26, and we've seen the outcomes of Paris Agreement. So what is the next step to try to reach the goals that we said that we would commit to achieve?
Rita, thanks a lot. It's a good question, because obviously one of the hopes, despite all of the rivalries and competitions in the world today, was that because we're all in the same boat, as Mike Ryan put it, particularly when it comes to climate change, you may be Russia, you may be the United States, you may be the EU, but we're all experiencing the same hot summers and forest fires and extreme weather events. So I was hoping that maybe multilateralism could at least be built around a common approach to climate change. Christina, I suppose you would be the natural person to start off with this. Is that the way that you see it from the European perspective?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jamie, and thanks a lot to the Netherlands for the question. I will not dwell for too long on what we are doing in the process of COP, but maybe a concrete example from another angle, namely the human rights angle. You might remember that last year the EU was first, let's say, and of course supported by many other countries in the Human Rights Council and partners, to make a plea for the recognition of the human right to a safe and healthy environment. So this is, in this whole context, a very important piece. This is something which we will continue to work on now. So we are planning an event now also in the course of March during the Human Rights Council on exactly this topic. It shows that, and we had lots of support from many other partners. It shows that how important that is to pin it down, really to let's say to elevate it at the next level. Because if we have recognized it as a human right, then of course we can be even more fiercely supporting this. So this is a concrete example what we did in the course of another entity, let's say, let aside the COP process, which is, of course, also very, very dear to us.
Thanks, Rita.
Back to you.
Thanks. Mohammed, I'm tempted, if you don't mind, to put this question to you too, because you remember at the COP26, India was seen, if I'm fair, to be sort of dragging its feet a little bit on the final day of the conference when it came to quitting coal as opposed to simply decreasing its use of coal, changing the text at the final moment. And there was a feeling that if we're going to keep to 1.5 of global warming, then quitting coal is basically the sine qua non. Otherwise, there's no way that we're going to hang on to 1.5 degrees as the target. So, Mohammed, I hope you don't mind if I come to you and ask, do you, from an India perspective, also see climate change as a good topic for multilateralism, or the last thing that you really want to put, or at least the Indian government wants to put into the multilateral framework? So over to you, if you don't mind taking that one, which came out of course, the good question that Rita from the Netherlands has put to us this evening.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, Jamie, that the West has read the Indian commitments at COP26 as being not enough. But most people in India was actually very surprised that India even made a net zero commitment at COP26. Yeah. And so this, I think, is an example of the challenges that we are seeing. Climate change probably should be that one topic that everybody is able to agree on. But to be fair, I think that to India and to the rest of the developing world, I think that the developed world or the West has got, to kind of carry a larger burden on this front. And they simply haven't quite made the efforts as yet that are required. For instance, the promise of $100 billion, towards climate finance never really materialized.
That is very true.
And so in some sense, I think that in the developing world, and India in particular, has far more to lose, I think, from climate change than most other countries, including in the West, because of the fact that India is a tropical country, heavily dependent on agriculture and the monsoons. And a lot of these climate patterns are already getting very erratic, leading to various droughts and floods across the country, and plenty of farmer suicides. So I think that in some sense it's justified on India's part on this particular issue, I think, to expect the developed world to do a bit more than it has been doing so far.
Very vigorous response, and reminding us again that we always need to be aware of the other perspective. Thanks. I won't go to the other two panelists on that one because I want to take as many questions as possible. So I'll give Rosebel and Mike the first bite at the cherry, if I can use that term, for the next questions, in the hope, of course, that they will go in their direction. So let's see if that's the case. We've got Kavita Dominic, please. So Kavita first, and then Isabel Durant. Isabel has already spoken, but she wants to come back in. So I will, of course, let you do that, Isabel, but only after Kavita. So Kavita, please.
Yes, firstly, thank you for such an insightful conversation. My question really was about how any of the four experts here perceive the relationship between multilateralism on the one hand and multipolarity on the other, because we've heard the word multilateralism being used quite a lot of times in our conversation today. And the reason I ask this is because there is the rather pessimistic view that the more number of nations you have who are trying to carve out spheres of influence within their own regions, whether it is Russia in Eurasia or China in East Asia, or arguably India in South Asia, it is all the more difficult for you to build the convergence of interests, which is so essential for multilateralism. On the other hand, do you think that it would be wrong to characterize both multipolarity and multilateralism as competing forces, and they do have some point of complementarity, which helps them to go hand in hand with each other? I'd love to hear what our experts think.
Okay, Kavita, thanks. That was a very articulate question and a very, very challenging one. Mike, I'm going to go to you on that if I can, because in your remarks you showed that you are a theoretician of multilateralism. So what's the difference with multipolarity? Are they the same thing? Probably not. So enlighten us, Mike.
Thank you, Jamie. No, it's an absolute fantastic question. I thank you for that. One of the challenges of multipolarity is it breaks down the collective interest into regional dynamics that then further diverge the smaller and smaller the groupings you get below that. The silver lining of what's going on now is our reality is characterized by a bipolar perspective. And that perspective is between democratic values and authoritarian ones. And so increasingly, and we see this in today's response to the situation in Ukraine, that those who would embrace democratic values on the one side are organizing themselves more efficiently and more effectively than they have in the past against those who embrace autocratic values. And so humans are simple people, and we tend to gravitate between two poles. And this bipolar perspective, I think, offers us an opportunity then to bring what is absolutely essential in the 21st century, and that is a geostrategic perspective to our regional conversations. Because any regional conversation that doesn't take account of global realities today is not going to be accurate or effective, because so much of what goes on everywhere is influenced by the top layer of that three-dimensional chessboard I talked about. And so as you go down into regions and subregions, there are smaller three-dimensional chessboards, and that was, I think, the fundamental basis of your question. So how does the larger multilateral mid-level of the global chessboard actually have an influence down into the regions and the subregions and bring those global realities, that global collective interest of democracies to bear on the decision makers in the various regions?
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very cogent, even professorial, if I could use that explanation. But I also want to bring in Rosebel. Rosebel, in Africa, there's often a perception that you're sort of in between a kind of democratic multilateralist narrative and the increasing influence of Russia, China, Turkey, other countries from the Gulf, and sometimes a more authoritarian approach to society and the economy, and that you're being sort of asked to choose one way or the other. Is that the way you perceive it? And maybe how do you see the difference between multipolarity and multilateralism? Be very good to get your own perspective on that. So the virtual microphone is going back to you now.
Thank you. Definitely. For me, it's very important to understand, like when we talk about multilateralism working for global issues, yes, it should work for global issues. But what happens in a dynamic like now, where you have empires basically competing? This is what has been our reality. If you come from a colonized country, that there's really not only one power you're dealing with in your country, and right to the elections that you hold that are being determined by somebody else. That in many of our countries, that young people wonder, what's the purpose of having an election if I know one dictator is going to be his back is being held by different interests, and they are both working. I don't care about the labels, whether you're China or Russia or United States. The fact that you are holding your interests over my own reality and my destiny does not serve any purpose. At the end of the day, is that are we able to have that self-determination? We haven't really had it. So for us, these are just semantics. You just wrap them when it comes to how you deal with a country that does not have such global power. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether it's coming from the US or China. At the end of the day, does it serve my long-term aspiration of being self-determinant, that I can actually change a government in my country without bloodshed, without losing my own home, without running to exile? That's for us, at the end of the day, that's what matters. And really we don't dwell on whether you label yourself democratic or not.
Yeah, that's a very, very important point. Multilateralism is about your ability to choose your own way in the international system and not have to choose one unsuitable model vis-a-vis perhaps another unsuitable model. Yeah, well spoken, effective point. I take it. In the meantime, Isabel, I mentioned wanted to come back, so Isabel, back to you. And then we've got from the chat, Burak Yusmak. You came, Burak, on the chat, but I hope you won't mind also intervening on camera in the debate. It's always better to see you and to hear from you. But first, back to Isabel, please.
Thank you. Just briefly, two remarks. One on the multipolar world. It's true that, of course, the regional trends is there, even before the pandemic, but I think that never the regional aspect can substitute the multilateral one. And of course, we can try to look how some regional agreement could be done, but I think that because especially the asymmetry between the powers, and it's true that between the US, the EU, the Russia, what will happen in the next days, but also about South Asia, it's not exactly the same power and the same strongness. So it's why it's important to keep the multilateral level as a key place. Second thing, the elephant in the room is trade, because now diplomacy is also related to trade domination. And we spoke about China, whatever we think about that, or Turkey, or other countries present in Africa. And it's true that the mercantilism or the diplomacy through trade is something which is key. And when you see now today how the price, the problem, the inflation in the developed countries, but also the price of energy, how difficult it is, and I would like to make the link with our young guest. It's true that on climate, how could we work together on climate, trade, and production and consumption? And that's an issue which is totally divided in the multilateral system. And even in the EU, we have trade on one hand, and on the other hand, climate. I think that it's an issue that we have to reconcile in order to look at the model. And I think that free trade is, of course, important, and we need integrated market. It's the case in Africa with the African free trade area, nice. But even in Africa, you will have a big difference between South Africa, for instance, Rosabelle will not contradict me, but also, I don't know, Lesotho or Guinea, or I don't know which part of Africa. So it's true that regional system will not solve all our problem. And secondly, we need to reconcile climate and trade, because trade becomes really the way to dominate the world. It's a case also for Russia with the gas issue. So I think that that's an issue that we have to look at very closely, very differently as we did in the past.
Yeah, thanks, Isabel. Of course, the reform of the WTO is very much on the agenda being talked about. I wrote my latest article for Friends of Europe on WTO reform, so I certainly have been looking into it lately. And of course, trade has to be environmentally conscious and friendly as well. Maybe somebody will pick up on your trade point in a moment, but I also didn't want to forget our second Debating Europe Young Leader video, because Carla, who should be on it, has put a question, and as she's gone to all of the trouble to make a video to put the question, the least we can do is to show it, and then I'll ask Burak, I see Burak already on the screen, to come in on the back of that. So can we, let's hear from Carla, please.
Hello, my name is Carla Alvarado, and I would like to ask how multilateralism can be intersectional to reach gender equality?
How can multilateral reach gender equality? Carla, thank you. That was pre-recorded, so I'm not sure if you've been following the debate this evening and obviously heard Rosebell say quite a lot on that, and I'll come back to Rosebell in a moment, who might want to develop it further, but hopefully you've listened to what she has already said about that. So your question, I think, has been partially answered, but we'll still give Rosebell a second, as I mentioned, bite at the cherry. Before I go back to our panelists, let me then go to Burak and see what question or comment you would like to make, sir. Over to you.
Hello, yeah. Thank you very much for all the panelists. First and foremost, I want to say that I agree with most of what has been said about multilateralism. And I have two questions regarding multilateralism and the way it works. And number one is, to what extent can the muscles of multilateralism extended beyond international organizations to sustain a just world? What I mean is, can think tanks play a role in brokering peace deals, or in, as we say, in track 2 diplomacy beyond closed doors? And the second question is about the next generation. I mean, how can the future be thrived through the next generation leaders and women leaders to embed in a multilateral system? I mean, if we speak about a just world or a so-called rules-based international order, I think we have to go beyond the, let's say, the democratic world or the transatlantic relations and reach out to the global south. And the global south had a growing young generation, as we saw last week in the Africa week, in Africa and Asia. I mean, how can those young leaders who are very connected to the digital space, who are much aware of what's happening around the world, be embedded in the multilateral system?
Okay, Burak, thanks. All right, that's it. We haven't got many minutes left. So what I'm going to do, Rosebell, question already to you on the relationship between multilateralism and empowerment of women. You've said a bit, but maybe you'll have some quick concluding thoughts. We had the trade issue, and then we had something that Paul Taylor also mentioned, but Burak developed that as well. The idea that the new multilateralism, Mike mentioned the private sector, is going to be more of a kind of track 2 citizens, NGOs, organisation type of thing, working cooperatively over borders to sort of generate pressure on governments who may be less keen, but eventually will be obliged to sort of go in the same direction. Is that the future? As I said, we've only got a couple of minutes and I need to wrap up. So I'm going to go, first of all, to Rosebell, a quick 1-minute response, please. Mike, any quick 1-minute concluding thoughts? Mohammed, quick 1-minute concluding thoughts, and as we started with Christina, like to finish with Christina. Quick 1-minute concluding thoughts. So that's the exam task. So Rosebell, you first.
Thank you so much. Definitely, we've had good examples on advancing gender equality in multilateral processes. Just last year, we had the Generation Equality in Paris, and we've seen a lot of countries making pledges and arriving at a certain understanding on the rights of women. But what happens, what remains behind largely, of course, we see the understanding and acceptance of sexual minorities and gender minorities remains way behind. And we've seen the the fight in the Human Rights Council, often countries rejecting resolutions regarding that. We've also seen progress in terms of women from Afro-descendant communities, with the Human Rights Council leading a lot on the decade of Afro-descendant people. So it's very important to see the intersectionality, not just gender as it is, but there are really good mechanisms we are seeing. And I think that we can do good if that is backed by real power and real investments to advance gender equality.
Thanks, Rosabelle. That was effective final statement. Mike, want to pick up anything in 1 minute final remarks?
Yes, President Biden once eloquently said that show me your budget and I'll show you what you value. And I think it's more about investment than trade, particularly foreign direct investment. When we look at the space bounded by security, environment, development, and human rights, foreign direct investment that's targeted into countries like South Africa that can help South Africans, and particularly female South Africans, build lives for the entire community, allows those communities then to have the wherewithal to deal with their security and environment challenges. And the addition of development between the EU, the United States, Britain, and others that assist that is how we integrate these economies together in the globalized economy, which makes everyone stronger, makes our democratic values more attractive to people in the world. And in that regard, I just wanted to get to Barack that track 2 in civil society is absolutely essential for educating not only the population, but for governments, because you can have better discussions in think tanks than you can in my government office at the Pentagon. Thanks very much.
Hopefully that means you're enjoying your new life, Mike, perhaps more than your previous existence, even though you occupied high functions. Then, Mohammed, any 1 minute again, concluding thoughts, maybe picking up some of those final points too?
Sure. I do agree with what Barack was saying. We have a template of sorts for this from the G20, where you've got various different forums within the G20 that bring together the business sector and think tanks and so on. They call the B20 for businesses, the T20 for think tanks. I think there's a Y20 for youth leaders as well. So there is a little bit of a template. And I think that template kind of really does work for 2 reasons. One is that corporations in particular are transnational. And so as Jamie put it earlier, they've got influence over governments around the world. But the second reason is the corollary to this, which is a bit negative, is that they're not as accountable. They've got far too much power. And so in some sense, you've got to try and get them to the table so that they're able to speak more transparently and openly and be accountable for what they do. And if such mechanisms can be built within the UN system and other such organizations, that will be very, very useful and helpful.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thanks again for a very succinct and pithy final set of remarks. As I said, Christina, we started with you, so it's appropriate that we give you, apart from my quick summary, which I promise will be super quick, Christina, we give you the final word.
Yes, thank you very much, Jamie. And I will be also extremely quick. When it comes to multilateralism, what we see when it comes to challenges, we see that challenges are global, but very often solutions are local. And this would be my final statement, together with the statement I made at the beginning of my intervention, namely that multilateralism works, and if it doesn't, it's our task, our common task, shared universally and globally through all UN member states. We need to make it work.
Christina, thanks. Four panelists, to Christina, to Rosabelle, Mike, and Mohammed, a big thanks from me, from the team here at Friends of Europe. What are the takeaways, as we often sort of call them in Brussels? Lots, I think, tonight. No alternative to multilateralism, but we've still got to make it work. We need to make it work, and not just built around a core of democratic nations, but reaching out to new partners, and we've heard Indian and African perspectives on that this evening. It's great to renew the vows, but not if it means that you have to revise the vows. We know what the principles are, but we have to make sure that everybody else understands and interprets the principles in the same way. We've heard a lot about trust in institutions, and at the end of the day, when the rubber hits the road, as we say, they have to deliver in real crises, to real people, real improvements. Otherwise, the windy rhetoric of multilateralism that we all, of course, sign up to begins to sound a bit hollow. We've heard about finding common topics that incentivize everybody, the South as well as the North. We've heard a lot about track 2 and bringing in civil society, the private sector. I think the COP process, even if some of you expressed a little bit of disappointment about the results, still showed the power of civil society and the private sector to add substance and energy to the debate. We heard about the way in which multilateralism has to sort of empower people to follow their own model, to defend their own interests, and not be forced to choose between somebody's unsatisfactory model vis-a-vis somebody else's unsatisfactory model. We've heard a lot about building communities of interest within the existing frameworks, outside the existing frameworks, informal structures, and mini-lateralism as well. And above all, we've sort of heard that at the end of the day, as Churchill once said about democracy, it's the worst of all systems, except when you look at the alternatives. The current setbacks to multilateralism, the biggest one, of course, having taken place in Ukraine this morning, shouldn't be a reason to abandon the whole thing in despair, but to turn our attention to why it didn't succeed in this case and how we can make it stronger so that at least we have a chance of preventing the current deterioration in the international system going even further. I think that is the task ahead. And we've heard tonight from both the transatlantic community and the EU how they can set about doing that, individually working together, but bringing in those other key players from Africa and India that we were privileged to have with us this evening. So on behalf of Friends of Europe, to all of you who stayed the course to the end, and even those who may have had to sort of switch off a bit earlier, many thanks for joining us this evening. 4 great speakers. Again, our sincere thanks to them. And I have to end as I always do, thanking the team here, Friends of Europe. You didn't see them on the screen, but without them, you wouldn't have seen me on the screen this evening, and you certainly wouldn't have had a debate, let alone such an interesting debate. So thanks again to the Friends of Europe team for organising the meeting, and I look forward to seeing you in some shape or form at a Friends of Europe event very soon. But from Brussels, have a good evening, stay safe, thank you.